Great. Okay. So I think we should move on. So we have Neil Vasquez.
Hi. Okay, I'll just get started. Hi, my name is Neil Vasquez. My project is titled The New Platztor Campus for the University of St. Gallen, a Quasi-autonomous Collective. And I wanted to start by saying that my thesis began with an interest in the autonomy of objects, in particular objects that are designed as individuals, seemingly without relation to one another. So now I'll take you through that early research to see how these objects and the idea was developed. So my thesis prep begins by appropriating assets and strategies for my fall vertical studio project produced alongside my partner, Jesse Gates, for a new Olivetti research facility. The assets we used were from Le Corbusier's design for the Olivetti factory in Milan. And by using techniques of translation, rotation, and transformation, it allowed us to produce new ways of re-seeing Corb's project. Using these methods, we were able to produce images which we began to unpack and develop into individual objects. Within the objects derived from the initial unpacking, they came in many possible orientations and configurations. However, we ultimately chose only a few we wanted to develop further. And so now these objects that exist without orientation, autonomous to their surroundings, are really placed close and in relation to one another, undermining the autonomy of each of them as they form an arrangement on site. So once we developed these objects, we then experimented with these wireframe drawings where they could begin to imply structure or facade or interior. These objects tended to be only seen in the exterior, so the wireframe allowed us a way into the objects in order to develop an interiority. So where the wireframes were one way to develop these objects, we also found a technique to see them once more through the use of 3D printing and the 3D printer, but more importantly, the misuse of the 3D printer and the 3D printer software, i.e. the Cura slicer. So now going into thesis, I decided to bring some of these objects along with me as new assets for a whole new site at a different scale with a different program. These objects arrived to the site as foreign entities. However, like the previous project, these objects, once placed in their site, are no longer completely autonomous. Rather, they enter into a quasi-autonomous state where they must reconfigure and retrofit aspects of themselves to meet the demands of the project. They are arranged in relation to the site and according to their proximity to one another. So the project and site is a campus extension for the University of St. Gallen in St. Gallen, Switzerland, in between the Historic Center to the south and the university to the north. The program size requirements for the site are a total of 17,500 square meters. The site has other buildings within it. However, the project guidelines do not consider any of the buildings as historically important and allow me to take a tabula rasa style approach to the site. This also grants me the opportunity to form a new relationship to the urban fabric of the city. The site is in this case not entirely urban and not completely singular either. So in the site plan, we can see the arrangement of 4 buildings placed uncomfortably close together. So the 4 buildings are the research facility to the west, the recreational facility in the middle, the teaching facility in the east, and the administration facility to the north. The organization of the building is tied to 2 major streets that separate the site from the historic center. However, there are 2 underground pedestrian entries or portals into the site on the southern edge, connecting to the historic center, and on the eastern edge, connecting to Stadtpark and the town hall. These entry points press up against the perimeter of the site, further pushing the buildings uncomfortably close together and further undermining their initial autonomy. So by pushing these buildings up together, they produce these moments of abducted space between the project site and the city. And so here I'm using an approach to urban autonomy drawn from Alvaro Siza's Cottbusser Dam project in Berlin, where the buildings register as both an assembly of individuals and are unified within a perimeter block.
Can I interrupt? Sorry, Hernan is texting me. He needs in, Peter. Sorry.
Oh. I mean.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Great. So I'll just start from this plan here. So when we finally arrive at the ground plan, we see that the individual quality of the building seen from above becomes much more fuzzy. Here, the quasi-autonomous objects can become one through the collection of the many. Their difference is not a means to create individuality, rather the individuality is united in plan. So coming back to methods of reseeing objects through the use of the 3D printing, the language that we began to develop through the misuse of 3D printer software was similar to the wireframe drawings in that they began to imply a texture, interiority, formal articulation, facade, etc. So by extracting that information that tells the 3D printer what to 3D print, i.e. the G code, I'm able to develop these textures in a more controlled way. So here we can see an idea for a form of facade treatment. This in turn allows me to reread and develop the objects further. So coming back to the buildings, beginning with the teaching facility, looking at the plan on the right, the four arms are where the classrooms are located, while the main body contains a large auditorium and communal learning space. While here at the bottom right render, the pilotis show the exterior egress and provide access to the interior of the campus and connection to the other facilities. So here's a view from inside one of those arms. In the administration building, the topography of the site plays a much more crucial role to the development of the building. The building now has to reconcile multiple methods of entry through its varying levels. So here we can see a view from the second floor lobby with light being able to penetrate both sides of the building and conditions of double height space derived from the site's shifting topography. So here are two views from inside the building showing the ways that the exterior facade articulation begins to appear on the inside. So moving along to the recreational building, containing both a library at the second floor and a cafeteria and cafe at the ground floor level, because of this constant coming and going, the abundance of multiple entrances on both sides of the building facilitate this flowing environment. So on the right in the section, we can see the proximity of the two buildings being the recreational and the teaching facility and the way that they almost touch each other but don't. And here we see a view from the second floor library. Lastly, we arrive at the research facility, the tallest building on the campus, and the design of the facade itself zigzags between both sides of the building, allowing for an even 50-50 wall to opening ratio. And in plan, we can see the partitioning of the rooms as well as the zigzagging quality of the facade informing the design of the rooms, while the section is able to carry a more repetitive nature with the workstations at the bottom portion and the office archival space up top. So on the left is a view of the entrance from the building, and on the right, we can see the view of the recreational and teaching facility coming close together, forming a canyon condition. And so finally, the following slides show the configuration of the buildings together. So here's a view from entering the canyon to the side. View again of the teaching facilities, piloti and egress stair. And finally, a view of the administration facility looking towards the campus. This view is particularly important in that we can see the ways that the buildings that began as objects with no relation to one another take on qualities of semi-type fits, and the way that their proximity to one another produces these unusual and mysterious moments within the campus. So the project ends with the idea that by sourcing and reformatting information in a new context through new methods and means, something new can be proposed, and that individuality and autonomy are not separate to a form of collectivism and unity, that their qualities can be brought together and enhanced at the ground floor through the ways that they frame each other. And so I'll just leave this final scene here just to get the conversation started. And thank you.
Perhaps I just have an interesting first comment. You know, when the first time when I think there's an interesting thesis about whatever the idea of the machine learning perspective could mean to making a plan. But when I saw the plan, what I found interesting is I've seen cartoon plans. You know, I've seen plans taken from paintings as a collage. You know, you've seen functionalist plan. But what I found interesting is I haven't seen a tool plan. You know what I mean? Basically, the layout of the objects on the site, yeah, has a logic that doesn't come from architecture, but comes from a kind of a tool assemblage, you know. And so I found it a very strange reading of your plan, even when it was a completely urban project. But I would suddenly look at it as if the arrangement comes from a distribution of a, I don't know, of a game or how to say, like a, how do you distribute the most amount of objects into on a site? It doesn't have a logic between the parts. Yeah, it just has a logic of placement, and so it produces a very strange in-between space. Not one that Gary would argue, that there's a new urban space on in-between, but and also not a kind of modernistic idea where you just say, like an acropolis, like I have just a temple somewhere on a site with some kind of relationship to it. So the autonomous of the entity not belonging to each other make a very strange plan,
Right.
I found it as a unique feature suddenly it pumped into my eyes, when I saw your presentation.
I like what you're saying, Peter. I think it's a super interesting way to even think about construction today. The kind of pseudo construction, it's not about building the real building with a 3D printer, but starting to understand some of the opportunities compositionally through the code of the slicer, through the Cura's interface. I think it's I'm fascinated by the idea. Maybe Neil, you could put one of those Cura photos on where yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Where we start to even think possibly about a different way of building or layering or constructing the building through the experiments that you were doing with Cura. I think that's a great way to think about construction. And maybe the challenge is that once we see your rendered photos, though, they look pretty conventional in terms of the understanding of poured concrete. So here's where I think the real opportunity is how to kind of reread or re-see the Cura models and then start to think about construction differently based on the textures and the kind of unusual tectonic that's getting developed. But overall, I want to say it's a really, really beautiful project. And I think the drawings are just gorgeous. And I've had an opportunity to see the models in real life, and they are beautiful as well. So congratulations, Neil.
I also find this slide and this particular point about your thesis, Neil, to be one of the most fascinating. And I think it raises the question of the kind of machine labor, right? The labors of construction, in this case, at the scale and stage of the model. And it ties ideas about drawing and kind of feeling the matter of architecture at the analog scale model, which are super interesting. So I think you figure out ways to kind of get inside that code and begin to use it with representational aims in a way. I think because you've shown other images where the project has a certain materiality, a certain tectonic, I see a bit of I wouldn't call it a disconnection, but perhaps maybe a rush to translate it to known materials in the sense that, I agree with Devyn that I don't think this means necessarily a 3D printed building. I think that will not be the proper instantiation of this, but perhaps a kind of aesthetic, a material aesthetic that begin to capitalize on the, on this idea of a kind of drawn object. And that sounds a bit like an oxymoron that, materiality eventually becomes at some level solid and needs to be built with not with lines, but with known materials. But I think the aesthetics of the lines and the kind of flickering, this idea that the object is never fully in focus, right? At least the model of the object never really kind of come in sharp focus as a kind of imageable object. To me, that seems like an interesting tectonic thesis that could be explored at one-to-one. But I think that doesn't necessarily means that the textures and grids that we see here as a product of the G-code and the extruder in the 3D printer necessarily mean the textures that we know in building material. Like I think you use brick or some other kind of texture materiality. I think there is a kind of struggle there. I don't know if I could name. If I don't even know if that material kind of exists in a way, but I think it's a kind of aesthetic. It's an aesthetic that necessarily needs to kind of struggle with the material rather than give it a solution right away.
Right.
Yeah, I really strongly echo what Devyn and Maxie, are saying, I think this raises a larger question actually about the responsibility of the architect vis-a-vis the means of design. So the means of design here, I think, are totally brilliant and are building on something. I just love it when people are so savvy, as you have been, about their design process, as to build on all the strongest things that they've done to date, which I really think this project does. So again, like the first project that we saw this morning, you're kind of catapulting yourself onto like way up into the stratosphere in the way that you began this project, which I think is just a super savvy move, and congratulations for that. But then you have a responsibility actually to locate the freshest, strangest, most productive aspects of your own design process and translate those into the final design. And I see the kind of drag of conservatism in the end of this project with the way the interiors, particularly the interiors, are rendered. And you and I have talked about this before, but also as others have mentioned, in the materiality of the project overall, and in the loss of that kind of beautiful flickering meshwork that seems inherent in the process of taking something that is a filament and something that is a line and translating that into a mass and a volume and an enclosure. And it's just not where we are today. To bring this project back to a kind of cast concrete or masonry monolithic structure with applied texture is, I think, a true loss, and one that I want you to jettison as you move forward with this very exciting project.
Mm-hmm. Fully agree, Marika. I mean, I'm just dying to build this in composites. I mean, it is just
100%.
To be woven, to be lightweight, to be kind of unusual in its tectonic resolution, where maybe it looks like a mass, but it's actually much more lightweight. There's a huge opportunity for that.
Well, I think it's back to, I totally, these are all really on the mark, but I think it ties back to Maxie's point about the line as well. And that, in fact, the filament is the way to take the line through into construction and into form. So I think that's a next level, maybe, development or thought process that, and I agree that there's a kind of drag back into the known. But on the other hand, I think the main focus of the project should be discussed and shifted also to the idea of the kind of quasi-autonomy, what Peter was talking about at the beginning, that has to do with the relationship between the objects.
I was going to comment on the decision that was made that lends the material translation its conservatism. And I think that that's a deferral to the sort of, to the contours of habitation in the interior of the building. So you are thinking about the upright occupant and the kind of vertical window and the horizontal slab, and those kind of spatial slices are supersede the translation of the G code. So you basically make the building defer to that kind of habitation slice, and that jettisons in its translation all of the sort of unusual lines of force that happen in the 3D printed models. So I think the conservatism is in thinking about the way the envelope works as an X-ray to reveal the spatial contours and inhabitants of an interior. If you thought about this envelope that kind of involutes or folds into the interior as something that doesn't have to be vertical or perpendicular to a floor plate, then I think it would open up the modes of translation, both for things like aperture and for the rhythms of facade making that you explore in the project.
Yeah, I want to join this discussion, talking a bit about the strengths and weaknesses of 3D printing something versus pouring something. The idea of pouring something, let's just use two concrete masters in the recent past, Tadeo Ando, for example, and Ensemble from Spain. I think these are two very different types of masters of concrete, but in both cases, the residue of the pour is really important to their work. When I say that, I'm talking about, for Ando, the residue of the formwork is almost as important as a texture as anything else. And for Ensemble, this Spanish group, if you don't know them, you can find them very easily. The texture or the residue of, I guess, nature as the formwork is kind of important to them. But in your case, what is, for the Andos of the world to achieve a sharp corner is easy, but to achieve a smooth curve, it takes a little more work. But in the case of something that's 3D printed, as Heather was talking about, some of the advantages of the types of line works that you're able to achieve, I think you're sort of not fully exploiting your advantages with the means that you're choosing. The other thing that I'll say is, so no, I'm in total agreement with the comments. I don't really know. I think it's maybe uncomfortable for you to hear about conservatism as a description, but I do think you're not maximizing your means. But the other thing I'll say is kind of interesting that maybe Maxi's starting to touch on this, but why should we care about parallax? The mesh quality. Should we care about? Because there's a moire effect that you're sort of highlighting in some of the drawings. Parallax, if you're interested, would have been early '90s discussion. But I just wonder what the other jurors might think about this quality of drawing or this type of treatment to line work.
One thing I will add, and I think the comments are right on the money, but one different way maybe to see it and for you to argue about in terms of what it has been, it has a certain kind of a dichotomy, is the possibility that actually this is setting the stage for something that can keep evolving. And when I was looking at your presentation, I was thinking of the music of Nicolas Jarre, the Chilean musician, which he experiments a lot back and forth between analog instruments and electronic music, and he makes a huge effort with the analog instrument to make it sound like electronic music, and the other way around. And there is a kind of excess of labor in that sense that it may look at first glance like a kind of a contradictory thing, but at the same time, if you start paying attention to it and you start to read the subtleties and the nuances of it, you start to see that there are possibilities that they get exposed by doing that. So I want to read your project more in those terms, and it's not maybe so much your thesis actually more than a project. I want to read it more like a thesis than a project. And I think if I read it as a project, I think all the comments and criticism are incredibly fair. And I think if I read a little bit as a thesis, I see it more as a setting the stage for things to evolve into something else. And that something else, there are glimpses about it. And again, this is an interesting conversation to have, and we've been having it for a while. I'm fascinated by this incredibly machine-driven kind of project that they make a huge effort to make it look like there's humanity in it. So I don't know, there is something also like almost like a Westworld thing going on in relation to that. But I think, and I would encourage you to take a look, to take a hear to Nicolas Jarre music, because I think there is something really compelling about that. And I think it has to do with the idea of the saturation of techniques and technologies and methodologies. And I think everybody's trying to figure out a way to navigate in certain humanity. So I think there are moments in your thesis that they are, for me, point more to that. And maybe that has to do with maybe the models and the 3D print. but and even I would say, like, it's fascinating, for example, the plan to me, because it's fairly clumsy. So there is something really interesting about the idea there's something that's done through machine, but they have a certain clumsiness. So there is something there in that kind of in-betweenness, which again, I will read that as a thesis in itself. And sometimes the project is just a platform for a thesis. So I find in that sense your project potentially very exciting.
I also want to add something. One last comment. I want to add, you see, I like this idea that you force a material into something that actually doesn't belong, yeah? And even when we all see in the renderings kind of, I don't know, Rudolph's brutalism, you know, or bricklaying qualities, I would like to read it as a 3D printing concrete, just making it look like as if it is poured concrete, you know? I mean, I could imagine, yeah, that even what it looks like is not that what it actually, but it comes from a 3D concrete printer, yeah. And so, so I know the comments. I totally agree this, but I like this idea. It fits in my category because I have no idea about materiality and colors. You know, that I always thought architects make just some stuff and then some other people just throw it into matter. Yeah. But I think this is what I would like to see, because you see, sometimes there are details coming out that make tectonically no sense. You know what I mean? And so I think these little moments where they are mismatching the tectonics with the geometry, I think that's why I thought you could read it as another concrete processing material printing, yeah, then instead of molding or precasting or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, but that's what I think. I think you're right, Peter, to point out. I like what Hernan is calling, and I think Hernan likes it as well. The clumsiness of the plan, exactly as you said, sort of laid out as if it were a kind of tool kit rather than a piece of architecture. And it's that if you were going to do that, if you were going to actually run through what it would be like to 3D print the building and then have these moments where suddenly that was revealed in a kind of unlikely mismatch of materiality or pattern, and that was done with the same kind of abandon and virtuosity as the plan, is just like, let's stick all these things as close as we can one to another, then I think you'd be actually exploiting your own process, Neil, to the fullest potential. But I think it's an incredibly generous read. I don't want you to think that you've done it yet, because it's such a rich process. It's such a cool project. You've gone so far with it. And then I think the retreat to as Heather was saying, the kind of known slab, window, structure, stair, interiors, the relentlessness of the punched openings, all at the size of the human, you know, et cetera, is something I think that you need to overcome going forward.
Yeah, Marika, just
Neil,
with your
sorry,
I'll just follow up with Marika really quickly. I think this is a super interesting comment that Marika is just making now, and it suddenly makes me think that we should bring Solowitz's drawing process into his thinking, into Neil's thinking. Solowitz may or may not need to be there to pencil the drawings, but the instructions are written in such a way that the story of the hatch is sort of, let's say, pre-composed by somebody who's not necessarily present. A kind of a story about autonomy or autonomous labor that may be related to your thinking. Mm-hmm. And I think the story of the hatch, as a textural treatment to the facade, to me, that suddenly becomes a lot richer as a way to read your work. If you read it as a story of the hatch. I'm sorry, Maxi, please.
I love that idea.
I was going to say one comment, Neil. I think you alluded to this in your earlier study model. Sorry, Hera, I cut you out. But one thing to me that brings back or ties back the notion of the drawn object with this idea of the 3D printer, the tool path, and the extruder, and this idea of objects coming together in a kind of a small urbanism of objects, this idea that the machine doesn't necessarily print just the object itself, but also prints the kind of support around it that one needs to kind of excavate in a way, right? And sometimes produces, as objects come in proximity to each other, this kind of bonding, this kind of rasterizing of the line that begins to kind of join things in proximity. So to me, that idea of kind of freeing architecture from its material trappings, it's something super interesting. Goes back to Michelangelo and his unfinished sculptures. These sculptures of man trapped into the kind of matter of the stone in a way. To me, that seems really pertinent in this kind of project, and I wonder if that kind of support that shows that proximity between things can begin to play a role in this kind of project as well.
I think that's a tremendous point that's embedded in this research program. And I think that it links, it's probably the more, I think, interesting way, as you guys are describing it, to be able to link this to the autonomy argument or the quasi-autonomous aspect of the siting and the organization of the objects in the site that allows us to reconsider that all of those exchanges. And gives life to this kind of image that we're seeing on the screen right now. So I don't want to, we still have another 10 minutes or so for this discussion. I don't want to bring this to a conclusion, but I just find this very incredibly interesting as a discussion relative to this thesis.
Could I bring up something in terms of like contrasting two modes of material production that might be interesting to think about? One would be, they're both like imagining tilt-up construction. I know that's kind of a funny thing to talk about. But if you imagine typical like concrete tilt-up construction, you would lay a slab of material down on top of a flat surface and then tip up that surface and put it into place. And typically tilt-up construction is trying to manage very efficient load paths and no weird stresses on the concrete panel. But if you thought about using a concrete extruder to lay down on a flat surface a series of hatches that are running at different directions, you're basically using line work to produce a mesh, which would be rigid, but carry load through that surface across different trajectories. And then you could lift that up and put it into place. So maybe it's about thinking about how you're laying material down, not the way we think of placing even cast in place concrete, where gravity is always running in the same direction while you're making it and after the building is assembled. But instead, like these models, you're laying material down against in a different orientation than you'll use it when you're carrying load. And that difference between having to build something in a flat plane and then orienting it in space to do a different job, I think allowing yourself that flexibility to understand the load paths could shift would allow you to get away from the expression you have in the current building.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting point. It makes me think that the potential of this is variations on the American cement building here in Los Angeles. I think, maybe here the hatch, the density of the hatch could be even higher, just based on what Heather was talking about.
That's a really, those are some really fun points you are both making, and the read back to Saul LeWitt is spot on. Neil didn't really speak about it, but the software that he used originally, maybe Neil, you could switch back to one of those like early graphic or kind of animated graphic images. That software that was developed in the office with Peter and myself, even the kind of animated black lights. Those actually started with a kind of inspiration from Solowit maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And so for you to make that comment is just like, it's incredible that it's somehow embedded in the way that lines and hatches and fills can really be still seen in such a fresh way today. I mean, I think we saw that in Nick and Dex as well, but the reading out of that for formal and representational projects we've seen, and it's very successful. But now I just love how the conversation is sort of reimagining that in a tectonic way. That's been one of the, I wouldn't say missing links, but it's really been one of the kind of next steps that I was hoping to see coming out of this graphic work. So I think those are really great points. I'm taking notes. I think it's really, really important and well said comments. So thanks to Heather and him and I for those points.
Yeah, that's awesome. I just wanted to come back to Ernan's point and also something he shared with us, the Nicholas Yar, that I think that that's another track in here that could also be extremely fruitful, which goes back to the clumsiness and the awkwardness that Neil embraces. This is not a naive project by any means. That there's also, I think, another track there which isn't necessarily to find a smooth continuum between the graphic project and the construction project, but rather a kind of set of gaps and dissonances. So there are different tracks one could go through here, and I think they're all very relevant. But I really appreciate the additional of the kind of phygital or digital physical weirdness that Ernan is also infusing into this discussion. I think shouldn't go slip by us either.
And I really appreciate everyone's comments. Yeah, especially ones that tie into that new materiality. Seeing the kind of conservatism that was developed at the end of the project. Obviously, if there was more time, it could have developed in a different way. But I think to another point, in that kind of idea that there's a sort of relationship to the human scale, and this kind of like I wouldn't say it's a subservience to modernism or modern ideals, because the sampling I was using was from Le Corbusier or from Caesar. So I mean, and I think in this idea also to the human scale, I don't want to make those references again. And if they came off that way, I think that was kind of maybe an unclarity of the project, because I don't want to reference the human, and I don't want to reference this verticality in the slab as something that's important today. And so I think that in this one view here in particular, most of the buildings at their center contain this band that breaks up that kind of human proportion. And here in particular, you can see it. So when the upright vertical human is up, there's a actual blocking of you being able to see outside. And so you actually have to look down and you have to look up, and you can't actually look directly in front of you. And so I think, in this kind of resampling of, the Le Corbusier and the modern project, I do want to be attentive to, the issues of today while doing these things. So I think the conservatism is not was not kind of a retreat back to conservatism and materiality, but it was a way for me to kind of tie back to modernism in a certain way, but using these kind of new formal articulations, this new kind of, cura development in order to somehow move forward or re-see it in a certain way. So that's what I would say about that in particular.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. This is
good work, Neil.
Thank you. Great stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Really good discussion. Fantastic. You really gave us a lot to think about here, Neil. Super.